Let's look now at the section under the law. This is a phrase that is often touted, often taught, often championed in Christian circles to mean, in a word, we don't have to keep the Torah as Gentile Christians. In other words, there's a phrase. This phrase is found in Galatians, but it's more often quoted from its location in Romans chapter 6. I think it's verse 14 and 15, where Paul says, "If you're under the law, you're not under the grace." I'm butchering it. I should have it memorized, but for some reason I'm drawing a blank. So those of you in the class, let me just pull up Romans chapter 6 for you real quick. I'm just going to use ESV, since that's the one I'm familiar with in the commentaries. And Romans 6, we looked at this in my commentary, but let me quote it for you. Romans 6, 14 and 15. "For sin will have no dominion over you, since you're not under the law, but under grace." Verse 15, "What then, are we to sin because we're not under law but under grace? By no means." And then Paul goes on to talk about, are you going to be a slave to sin, or are you going to be a slave to righteousness? But this phrase, under the law, it's very popular in Christian circles. It's very vogue to teach that under the law means that you're obligated to keep the Torah. And therefore, when Paul says in Romans, you're not under the law, but you're under grace, this seems to be Paul's way of saying, you're not obligated to keep the law, but you're obligated to fall into the grace of Messiah. Something to that effect. So let's read what I wrote in my commentary and see if that's what I think Paul's saying in Romans and in Galatians. Beginning with section 7, we turned our eye to another one of Paul's famous law phrases. Remember, we got under the law and works of the law. Earlier on in the book of Galatians, most often we found that the technical term under the law, in quote unquote, under the law, was also used as another way to speak of Jewish identity, right? Sometimes under the law means that. For Gentiles wishing to be included into Israel, what I found is that the man-made ritual known as conversion could ostensibly secure this legal identity. I say ostensibly because from man's perspective, from a limited covenant perspective, Israel seemed to be micromanaging what I call the immigration into Israel in first century. And basically they were declaring Gentiles to be Jews, even though we know from a heredity perspective, from a heritage perspective, from a what we might call a racial perspective, if we can spin Judaism that way for a moment, there's no way to really change one's ethnicity. If you're really tying it to biology, you're not really changing anything biologically at all. It's really a legal declaration and a loss of some skin and some blood, right, to be quite graphic. But that's what the Jews were doing to the Gentiles in the first century, and all of that to declare them legally standing Jews. So Gentiles were brought into Israel through the ceremony. By the time we get to the latter half of chapter 5 of Galatians, however, Paul had changed his polemic tone and was now assuring those truly in Christ that if they're led by the Spirit, they're no longer slaves to the old nature, viz., they're no longer under the law. We also read that having the mind controlled by the old nature is death. It's really neat that if you read Galatians chapter 5 with Romans chapter 6 in view, if you have both of them open or read one right after the other, you're going to find that they both speak of this idea of under the law and having your mind controlled by the old nature is death. And Paul's really explaining that you're either going to be a slave to sin because you haven't accepted God's free offer of righteousness through his son Yeshua, or you're going to be a slave to righteousness once you are declared righteous by God himself. You can't have it both ways. You're either a slave to sin or you're a slave to righteousness. Conversely, as we discussed under the law, having the mind controlled by the indwelling Ruach HaKodesh is life and true shalom. Those who are controlled by the flesh cannot please God, Paul says in Romans, and that's Romans chapter 8, and they're destined to suffer the ultimate punishment that Torah spells out for unrepentant sinners. And this is basically condemnation. Ultimately, it's condemnation. If you don't accept God's gracious offer to accept Yeshua, then you're basically headed for condemnation. That's the ultimate punishment. So this under the law condemnation, give me a moment here. This under the law condemnation aspect is what I believe Paul meant by its usage in Galatians 5:18. Galatians 5:18. And his theology is taken squarely from the Torah proper when Paul says that if you're not in Messiah, you're under the law, you're under condemnation, you're under the punishment reserved for unrepentant sinners, for remorseless sinners. This theology is rooted in the Torah proper. Specifically, as I say in my commentary, to be, quote, under the law, end quote, is a pejorative position, and it's originally hinted at all the way back in Deuteronomy.